Okay, so Pat, do you want to give an intro to this site?
Okay, yeah. This site, actually,
Thanks.
the soils had a whole lot of compaction because it used to be much steeper, but we made two 500,000 gallon ponds. We put the dirt here and spread it. We even bought some more dirt to try and level this out so it was more useful as agricultural land. And then John Henry Nelson, who's on our team and is a wonderful permaculturalist, put these berms and swales, and that's designed so that they fill up completely before the water flows to the pond. You know? So these things now, even with the drought, should have plenty of moisture because the aquifer should be supercharged right here. Because the first thing that happens with every significant rain is this fills up, and then when it's actually can't take any more water into the ground, then it flows into a pond, which is over there. You can kind of see the asters and stuff lining it. And we have basically just done cover crops on here now for this is the second year, and we'll do them probably another 3 years before we try and use it for agriculture again. And then it'll be used for, this is the main animal farm, it'll be used for experimenting with mob grazing followed by the production of agriculture, and even pasture farming, whereby you graze the pasture down to a point where you've actually impacted it so it's not doing well, and then sow forage crops, you know, things like beans and grains into it. And by the time they're mature, the pastures come back, so you never have to. Frankly, I think that's the way it's got to go for the Midwest if there's any hope. You know, if we're still going to have animals on there, they have to come off the feedlots. It has to be mob grazing, and it has to be pasture farming. So that's what's going on here, and this, believe it or not, has been weed eaten twice this year. That's the challenge, and we put wood chips down to try and make it easier to control them. And basically, I see places where they aren't at all, where they didn't do well for some reason, but where they are, they're not being impacted massively by what's competing.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the first thing we'll do is give a little spiel just on hazel genetics, because it's really kind of the primary hurdle for this in our area. And then we'll get more into what's planted here and sort of the specifics of all that. So basically, every hazelnut product that you can buy in the store is made with European hazelnuts. So Corylus avellana is the Latin name. Something like 75% or more of the global production of hazelnuts happens in Turkey. There's a huge long history of that going on there for many thousands of years. There are species of hazels that grow pretty much everywhere in temperate northern hemisphere. So like with acorns, there's a long subsistence history of use all over the northern hemisphere. In the United States, really the only significant hazelnut production happens in Oregon. And the reason for that is partly because Oregon is really, the Willamette Valley is the most similar to European climate in North America. The other thing is that our Native American hazelnut species have a fungus that grows on them. Its common name is Eastern filbert blight. They have co-evolved with it. It doesn't seem to negatively impact them at all. But the European species has almost no resistance to that blight, and most European genetics will just die anywhere from between about 3 years to about 10 to 15 years. They'll get the fungus, and it's very similar action to the chestnut blight, where it'll essentially girdle the stems and they'll die to the ground. So that's the reason that there is no East Coast hazelnut production historically. What's happened so the hazelnut industry in Oregon was established somewhere around 40 to 50 years ago. They used all just straight European genetics. Humans, in doing what they do, transported Eastern filbert blight over to Oregon. And so there now is Eastern filbert blight there. So their in dealing with that, they are either spraying enormous amounts of fungicide all over their plants, or OSU, Oregon State University, has bred cultivars of pure Europeans that are blight resistant. So they sell them and promote them as blight immune, which is not at all true. There's work going on at Rutgers up in the Northeast, where this guy has been working for about 20 years breeding all kinds of stuff, and he takes every genetics he can get his hands on and inoculates it with blight. He's had people mail him blight samples from all over the East Coast. His sort of conclusion is that the blight genome that we have across the East Coast is massively more diverse than what it's made its way to Oregon. And so they can breed stuff in Oregon that is resistant to that strain of the blight, but once you bring it back over, it can't cope. What I've done at my place in trying to sort of figure out what is the way forward with this stuff is I've planted everything from the pure Europeans bred by Oregon State through to pure Native Americans that I foraged off of roadsides and pasture edges all over our area. There are a couple projects working on hybrids of those two species. A lot of that's going on in the upper Midwest. Basically, the sort of idea behind it is they want to replace soybean annual agriculture with hybrid hazelnuts. There's been breeding work to that end going on for somewhere between 30 and 40 years. The latest study that I saw that was done by the University of Wisconsin was on a 7-year trial plot where they planted, half of it was plants that were unselected wild American hazels that they got from their Department of Natural Resources. The other half was controlled cross hybrids sourced from these nurseries that have been breeding them for 30 years. The unselected wild stuff produced about 20 to 25% more kernel yield than the controlled cross selected hybrids. So again, sort of the point that I made earlier in all this rambling is that it takes an enormous amount of resources to do intensive breeding of woody plants. And as far as I'm aware, there is not a breeding program that has something where they can say, this is yielding 10 times what our Native American is. There is no like order of magnitude increase in what is going on. So anyways, that's kind of what is out there. The first question I would have within that realm is why? Why don't we just use the Native American? What people told me when I was sort of starting out in this stuff is, oh, they're all too small, they're not worth messing with. So that can be true. And what I've found is that somewhere between 5 to 10% of the wild plants that I have observed will produce nuts that are about that size. And personally, I consider that not a subsistence activity, trying to deal with these. It's just the size of that in proportion to human fingers is just not a calorie positive equation. So from some of the Oregon bred Europeans that I planted 7 years ago have started producing a little bit. This is a nut from those. So just to give a comparison, that's the realm of possibility that we're looking at. What I have found in going through wild populations is that somewhere around 5% or a little less of wild unselected Americans will produce nuts of this size. So again, this is a pure European that had a lot of money go into its breeding. This is a wild American that had absolutely no money go into its breeding. Then there are some, so there was a lot of interesting woody plant breeding going on about 100 years ago, prior to world wars flipping the entire economy of the world upside down. And some of that stuff has been revived. Actually, a lot of that is the parent stock of the upper Midwest initiatives trying to breed this stuff. A couple of those hybrid cultivars that I planted started producing this year. That is from one of them. And so that's larger than the pure European. This is from another one. I don't remember where I pulled these out of. Okay. This was the pure European. Oops. So again, that's the hybrid cultivar, that's the pure European. That's more or less indistinguishable.
Is the hybrid cultivar resistant to the blight?
Those hybrid cultivars are more resistant than those European cultivars, as far as I have seen and as far as I can research to find out. One of the differences in these species is that the Europeans tend to grow as a single stem small tree. They top out somewhere around 15 to 20 feet tall, and they will sort of sucker out a little bit, but they tend to want to have one stem. The Native American species grows as a multi-stem shrub. So it's very similar to like elderberry or blueberry, if you have any experience with those. It wants to grow lots of different stems. My non-scientific hunch is that that is a coevolution with that fungus. So when the fungus started affecting that plant where it was killing off stems, it over time figured out how to just grow lots of stems all the time. Then having that adaptability, it then figured out how to, like even on individual stems, I see the native blight, but it doesn't kill those stems off very effectively. So another sort of factor that I've been looking at with these hazels, the Europeans have a very open husk on them. So the way that these are grown in Oregon is that they wait for the nuts to drop off of the tree. They then sweep all the nuts into windrows in between the alleys of the trees, and they then drive over them with machines to suck them all up. In order to accomplish that, they spray herbicide to completely remove the entire understory. If you look at pictures of those farms, there is not a single green thing in those orchards other than hazels. There are organic hazelnut operations there, and as far as I can tell, they just mow to death the established perennial understory under those plants so that they can then still sweep up everything. From what I have seen and observed on the East Coast in our ecosystems is that hazelnuts are the preferred food of every rodent I'm aware of. There's also quite a number of birds that like them a lot. From what I've seen and from what the folks are doing in the upper Midwest is that these open husked Europeans that want to drop their nuts as soon as they're ripe are not going to work here. That's wildlife food. Just the prospect of trying to get those harvested, there's a very narrow window of when the nut ripens and when it's laying on the ground and not accessible. So that's the other factor that I'm looking at in all of these is that these, actually what I did this year with my European hazels, because I saw there was a crop on them, is I just, right before they were ripe, I ran my pigs underneath them and left them there longer than I ideally would, and they cleaned it up pretty well. Obviously, that's, with food safety modernization acts, that's not going to fly on a commercial scale, but it's doable. But what I've looked at and the way that I deal with the Native Americans is I want fully enclosed husks on the nuts. This is the way. So these are pure Native Americans that were just growing wild on our place that I harvested yesterday. So this is what they look like on the tree. Y'all want to pass some of these around. They have a fully enclosed husk. The way that I check to make sure they're ripe enough to harvest is I peel open the two halves of the husk, and if the shell is starting to change color, that's a good sign. If you can put a thumb on it and get it to wiggle free of the husk, they're ready to harvest. The husk is a modified leaf, and you pull the whole thing off. So even if they're, half of a plant is not quite ripe, they'll ripen up out of that husk to some degree. But this, in looking at a bunch of the hybrids and trying to figure out how this is going to work, I very much think that hand harvesting enclosed husks off of the tree is the only way it's going to work in our region. I just don't think fighting with rodents on the ground is going to fly. At least not for me.
What's your thoughts about harvesting them a little early to beat out the squirrels or rodents?
Right. It's definitely viable to do that. That's when I've looked at the ethnographic stuff of like what indigenous folks were doing with these. Most accounts say that they preferred to harvest them and eat them in the milk stage. So, if you know what Milky Oats are, it's the same sort of idea. Like before a seed ripens fully, it's sort of viscous liquid inside. My hunch is the reason they preferred them that way is that's the only way they could get them. So yeah, it's definitely doable. I usually don't want to do that. So to some degree, you're not going to, so ripening up and filling the kernel with all those fats that we want is the last stage of ripening. The other thing is that because I'm looking for seed, it's not going to be viable if I harvest too early. So it's definitely doable, but not preferable.
Do you successfully keep the rodents away as they're on the tree?
Yes, there's a few sort of factors with that. One is that I run pigs through the alleyways of my plantings, and pigs eat rodents. They're omnivores. So there's basically not much rodent habitat. There's 12 to 15 to 20 foot gaps of rodent habitat in between my rows. That's one factor. Another factor is I stopped counting at 1,000 hazels. So it would take an awful lot of rodents to eat every single nut. I find husks where you can see they've like ripped one of the halves of the husk off and eaten the kernel out of a nut. But it's not significant. It's like I wouldn't even chalk it up as any kind of loss. In general, what I would say with hazels, like when I'm trying to push these on people, I want them to plant as many as they can possibly cram into their property, basically. There's a couple issues in there. One is that hazels are they're a non-self-fertile wind pollinator. So in the same way that you wouldn't plant 4 corn plants and expect to get awesome ears of corn because the pollination just wouldn't fully occur, same thing with hazels. If you plant 3 or 4, there's just not going to be enough pollen flying around during the flowering to get full effective pollination. The other thing is that the highest numbers I've heard for kernel weight yield on a hybrid hazel is 4.5 pounds. So it's an extremely dense food, 4.5. So the numbers that I use to sort of extrapolate all this stuff is I assume off of a good, so like this pot, not including the husk nuts, just the shelled nuts here, or not the shelled nuts, the husked nuts in here, are all from my largest pure American plant. Once these, it's about 50% weight is shells. So once these are shelled, this is going to be about 1.5 pounds of kernels. So that's not a whole lot per plant. But again, it's an extremely dense food, super high in fat. There's about 3,200 calories in a pound of hazels. But again, in trying to work with this plant, my recommendation is to plant as many of them as you can possibly justify. Because if you want to get a decent yield out of them, you want as many as possible. Yeah.
How much sun do you need? I picked some of these 2 days ago and it was total understory. There was no light getting into it.
Right.
I don't know how much they would have, but they did have nuts.
Right. They're capable. I've got some on my place that just are growing wild in basically full shade, and I got some nuts off them, but inevitably you're not going to get as much. So their ideal habitat is full sun riparian. So like an old timer name around here for them is river nut. So they tend to like wetter bottomland type of areas. And that, like on our place, there was one when we came there that's its roots are in the creek bank. Like when we get high flood waters, it's half of the whole plant is submerged in water. So they can tolerate wet feet totally fine. That's great for them. They do have very large, robust root systems. So once they're well established, they're pretty drought resistant. And can definitely tolerate sort of drier soils. But if I was going to try to establish a planting in that sort of scenario, I would want to figure out some sort of irrigation in the earlier years to get the roots down.